an original MCM production.
Thank you for a chance to, again, be a part of your noon meetings. I really want to thank you for that. We're going to have 3 segments to this program. First, former Senator Russ Feingold is going to talk about his campaign. Then I'm going to interview him. And then at 1 o'clock, we will take your questions. So we will, however, respect your time and end on time. So let's begin. A Janesville native, Russ Feingold graduated from Craig High School, UW-Madison, Oxford University, and Harvard Law School. The Democrat was elected to the state Senate in 1982 and served in the state Senate until his 1992 election to the U.S. Senate, where he served 3 terms, winning re-election in 1998 and 2004. He lost his 2010 re-election bid, but since then he's taught at Marquette, Lawrence, and Stanford universities, and served as a special U.S. State Department emissary to Africa, including the Republic of the Congo. He is challenging Republican Senator Ron Johnson in the November 8 election. Join me in welcoming our guest, Russ Feingold.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here in Milwaukee today. Since I launched my campaign, as a lot of you know, I've traveled to all 72 counties in 2015, last year, and I'm well on my way to doing the same thing this year. We've been to about 38 counties and tried to go to an innovative business in almost every one of those counties. Now, what I'd say to you is this has to be done. It has to be done if you want to run a campaign, and it also is essential to do if you're a representative of the people in office. Otherwise, you miss a lot of important stuff. You don't know what's going on if you don't get out and meet the people. As I listen to the people of Wisconsin, of course, I'm struck by the breadth of experiences and industries, cultures, and traditions across our state. And I'm lucky that I'm one of the only persons, because of the career I've had, that actually gets to see the whole state. You know, there are not a lot of jobs that cause you to go everywhere in the state. And the breadth of things in this state are astonishing. And frankly, it's just a lot of fun to get around Wisconsin. And of course, while I visit all of the counties, I visit many counties multiple times over. And no county more than, of course, this one, Milwaukee County. In fact, during this campaign, I've tried to put a special focus on the needs and challenges that Milwaukee faces. I want to thank you for having generously taken your time to share with me your thoughts and experiences, all the way from MATC to Generator to, of course, the Water Street Brewery. Committing to listen to the people of Wisconsin, from Milwaukee to Marshfield, is essential both for a candidate running for office and for a public servant. And it's just amazing to me. If you really get out there, I've noticed, for example, the concerns that are growing around this state about water quality, groundwater, algal blooms, other threats to the environment. It's a huge issue all across the state, but if you wait to get that word in Washington, you're not going to get it the same way. But you also find out positive things. Things like technology that's being developed down at the Milwaukee Water Hub, where a company there has come up with a device that can show you what is actually in the groundwater below your land, something that has not been possible in the past. So there's both the problems, but also the solutions if you get out and talk to people. And you know, I think this is particularly important during a time when so many candidates and elected officials are embracing a cynical path of divisiveness. Now, like you, my friends, I've been following the presidential campaign pretty closely. Who isn't? I'm guessing you would agree that this is just one of the strangest political seasons anyone's ever seen. And at its worst, where we see the beginnings of physical confrontation and violence, it's getting downright ugly. What do you tell young children whose first exposure to American democracy is petty name-calling and hatred and violence? Doesn't remind me of the Kennedy-Nixon debates I saw when I was 7 years old. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I know that they were treating each other with respect. That's been lost. When my parents taught me about politics, it was about civility and respect and community. In fact, my father, Leon, was a member of the Janesville Rotary. As a matter of fact, Paul Ryan's dad was practicing law in the same building in Janesville. But he was one of only 2 Democrats in the Janesville Rotary out of about 130 members. But he knew his Republican peers, his family friends, and his civil men. Sure, when they finally made him president after many years, he got up there, and his good buddy Bob Lovejoy, a big Republican, would always say right out loud, "Sit down, you gol darn Democrat." That was how the meeting would begin. But they cared about each other. They were dear friends. They just wanted to get things done and enjoy the community that all those families had helped build. Today, it's hard to even recognize the democratic process we grew up with. And judging by the coverage on cable news, you could come away with the impression that all of America is angry and partisan and that our differences are irreconcilable. But as I continue to travel Wisconsin, what I hear from students and business owners and farmers and teachers and families couldn't be more different. Not just in substance, but in tone. Of course, some people are angry. But in general, Wisconsinites aren't new to this election's harsh debate. We've actually had to live through the last years a whole lot of harshness and divisiveness right here in this state. But I believe that Wisconsin's tradition of respect and bipartisanship is alive and well and can be fully revived if we all commit to it. People are ready to unite to help solve our problems and grow our economy. I want you to know that when I went up to Russ County, Wisconsin, and talked to the people at the Business Development Office, no one said to me, "Gee, I really miss the days when we could punch people in the face at rallies." Nobody said that. They said, no, that Milwaukee company, Rockwell Automation, has a very important plant up there that is doing very important things to maintain the economy of that county that used to be unemployment at 17%, now it's at 5%. When I went to Hudson or Coloma, nobody said to me, "Gee, we need to ban Muslims from entering the country." They told me that we need to improve our broadband access so our small businesses and students can compete with anyone. When I visited Crandon, Wisconsin, way up in Forest County, to tour a great business there that builds these trolleys that we see all over America, I didn't hear anybody say we needed a wall either between here and Mexico or Canada. I heard about the need to increase our education and training programs so that more Wisconsinites can find good-paying jobs, and there are jobs open and available all over this great state if we have the good sense to connect people up with the proper training. And when I visited the technical schools in Eau Claire and Wausau and right here in Milwaukee in the last 2 weeks, the administrators and the teachers didn't tell me they wanted the United States Senate to do everything they could to block the president from appointing a United States Supreme Court justice. Nobody said that to me. They told me they need our representatives in Washington to make sure they have the funding to continue their work, retraining those displaced people that have been displaced by unfair trade and other circumstances, whether it be IT programs, healthcare programs, or manufacturing programs. So my friends, even after all the division that's occurred in our state, after the tense Thanksgiving dinners that I've heard about and the attack ads, the people I meet across Wisconsin are ready to unify. They're ready to get back to working together to build our communities. And there's also a recognition that a huge part of that is improving our economy, bringing some kind of sense of balance back. All are connected in this regard. And I'll give you a very telling example, especially in light of the fact that we had somebody from the realtors give the invocation. So I met with one of the leading realtors in the state. I had heard a rumor that some of them are Republicans, but, you know, there's different kinds of realtors, and this one was probably Republican, but he was friendly. And I said to him, you know, what are your top concerns? And of course, I've worked with realtors for many years, and I wasn't surprised at the first two. He said, first of all, we have to keep that mortgage interest deduction. I totally agree. It was essential in me being able to afford a home. Secondly, he said something that didn't surprise me that I agreed with, though. Let's keep those state and local property taxes deductible. Very important when you live in Wisconsin. That's important for affording a home. But then he said our third priority is the problem of student loans. Hesitated for a second, and I knew exactly what he was saying. He's saying that when you're a realtor and you find a nice young couple and they both have decent jobs and you want to sell them that first house, if they got huge student loans, they can't buy that house. You can't make that sale. And if you're not able to sell them a house, that means the person that builds the house doesn't get the work, the person that makes the window up in Ladysmith that goes in the house doesn't get the work, the person that paints the house, who I was meeting with yesterday here in Milwaukee. It's all about all of us together when there is something as difficult as the burden of student loans. So the effects of not solving these problems hurts all of us. It hurts the economy as a whole. All these things are connected, and that's what I'm hearing from people. And we're not going to get any of this done with name-calling or insults. We can only progress by listening, and that's one reason why since the beginning of this year, 2016, I introduced something called the Badger Innovation Plan to help grow Wisconsin's economy. The plan has 4 major points. First, we have to do something to modernize our transportation infrastructure, both traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges, and our digital infrastructure to make sure all of Wisconsin has access to high-speed broadband. Second, and this is something I hear from businesses all over the state, we've got to redouble our efforts about skill training. That means including investing in career technical education and STEM education and maintaining a robust apprenticeship program. And that's because employers are looking to hire and they depend on these programs to deliver the trained workforce they need. At all the different campuses I went to last week where they're doing the training, they told me they can't keep up with the requests and demands of the employers. They actually could benefit tremendously from more students and more training. Third, we need to drive innovation by connecting our entrepreneurs with the capital they need to thrive in a 21st century. In addition to ideas, workers and strong management, innovation-driven companies, like all others, need capital, and the federal government has a role to play in this. And we know this here in Wisconsin, where the UW system's research and technology transfer is an economic engine that the state's economy relies upon, and this is especially relevant right here in Milwaukee, where, fantastically, we have the new R1 research status of UW-Milwaukee. What an achievement. What a tremendous achievement. We should be front and center promoting that. Finally, we need to make sure that Wisconsin exports its products, not its jobs. We must help our businesses, especially our small and growing businesses, compete internationally. But I think we also need to ensure that our trade policy is built on the needs of Wisconsin companies, not just those giant multinational companies that dominate the negotiating process of these trade agreements. This new trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is shaping up to cause the kind of damage to our middle class and spike our trade deficit just like previous trade deals like NAFTA. I wasn't fooled by NAFTA, even though my president and vice president of my party wanted me to vote for it. I voted against it, and I'm not fooled by the TPP. For many Wisconsinites, no one issue has greater impact on a community than the baseline question of whether or not you can find a job, and if you have a job. Once you've got that decent job, having the security of knowing that it's not just going to be shipped overseas. The Wisconsin economy is ready to go, whether from Chippewa Falls or even way up in Iron River, Wisconsin, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There is an energy in the people of Wisconsin. I've been to so many businesses, so different ones come to my mind, but this one's coming to my mind right now. In Princeton, Wisconsin, right near Green Lake, beautiful lakes there, sort of tourism-based area, a guy from Chicago, not a Wisconsin, who used to come up there with his family every year for vacation, decided that he wanted to be back there. So what he's done on the main drag there is he's opened up a stereo place, a place where he's manufacturing beautiful speakers on the main drag, Princeton Audio. They're beautiful, made out of local wood. $300, I feel like I've become a salesman for this company. But you know, he chose Wisconsin because of the quality of life. But now, because of the internet, because of other things, that kind of thing can happen and is happening all over the state of Wisconsin in places it never would have been able to happen before. That's the reality out there that we need to listen to and make sure we follow through on. So people in this state are not interested in insults, they're interested in results, and I'm running for the Senate to help bring about those results. Thanks for having me.
You ready, sir? Your campaign website reminds us that you were the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act. So let's start with national security. In the cell phone encryption issue, who's right, Apple or the U.S. Department of Justice, sir?
Well, anyone who thinks they completely understand this and know all the details, that would be kind of hard to imagine. Having said that, I have instincts about this sort of thing based on my work in the Senate, not only on the Judiciary Committee where these were brought up, but on my 5 years on the Intelligence Committee, where I was read in very closely on the NSA program and others before some of the revelations that occurred. So I have a bit of a sense of how I think this can work, and my belief is that it would be a mistake to push Apple and other companies to create a complete backdoor that could be utilized by just about anyone. And, you know, I'm not the only one that has said this. General Hayden, who I disagreed with on everything in that intelligence room. I remember, I've written about this, I remember his description of the torture program where he downplayed what it really was, and I was irritated with him, voted against him. He's the only guy that was the head of both the NSA and the CIA. What did he say about this? This would be a huge mistake for national security to do that. Now, obviously, I want us to be able to get these terrorists. I want us to know how these San Bernardino people did what they did. I want us to be able to get the information in that phone. And I understand there were errors made by the government in terms of the passwords and so on. But to expand it to the point where it opens up everything, my instincts tell me it's not a good idea.
Thank you. Let's stay on the issue of terrorism. Russ, what is the best way to fight ISIS? And if it involves American soldiers on the ground, how many soldiers, sir?
First thing to do is to figure out a way we can stop trying to only look at problems in one narrow way. How did ISIS become the only threat? How come people don't talk about Al-Qaeda anymore? Al-Qaeda is a threat in many places in the world, including some of the attacks in recent days. So you have incumbent senators, including the current incumbent senator that I'm running against, always talking about ISIS, but what about the problems with these other groups? We have to look at this in a more systematic way. That these are a series of organizations, and if we just go from one organization to the other, they start regenerating themselves. So what do? We cut them off. We cut off their ability to function. We don't send 100,000 ground troops, as Senator Johnson has at least suggested, to the ground to take over that area, and then the next day look around and go, now what do? Let's cut them off. Let's cut off their oil supplies. They rely on selling oil. They have an outpost in Libya now where they want to do this kind of thing. We need to destroy their oil facilities and destroy their ability to transport it. Arms. They get arms supplies coming in from overseas through the Turkish border. We have a capacity working with the Turks to deal with that. Finances. Cutting off their finances. Again, because of the internet, we have an ability to cut off finances in a way we haven't had in the past. And we were even recently able to destroy a warehouse that was full of Iraqi money, which they used for walking around money. Cut off their finances. And let's have more intelligence resources in the region, human intelligence. It's a tough job, tough assignment. But if ISIS gets the idea that not everybody that comes in to see them maybe is a friend, they're going to be a little more concerned. So these are all things we should do. The stupidest thing we could do would be to go in and just invade and try to figure it out later. So there is an enormous distinction between my approach and that of the incumbent senator.
Do you see the need for any American ground forces in that, sir?
There currently is a force that I think is very effective, based in Iraq to do targeted attacks that Secretary of Defense Carter has not only proposed, implemented, but it has been effective. That sort of thing I think makes a lot of sense. I want to see these leaders of this organization destroyed or captured. In fact, some of that is happening right now. As if you're following the news, we have to be in a position, even in a campaign year, where maybe we can talk about this beyond politics. I mean, would it kill a couple of Republicans to admit that maybe a couple of things are being done right here? Aren't we in this together? And the same thing for Democrats. Everything should not be a cheap shot at the other side when we're all trying to stop these monsters from existing. We need to get back to the days when, it was before I was in the Senate, when there was this view that some of this foreign policy stopped at the shores and that we tried to unify and that kind of thing when we were talking as a country.
Does America have any responsibility to help rebuild Libya and at some point Syria?
Well, it's not as if what we did in these places was sort of because of our actions. So I would think the whole world has some responsibility to participate in trying to stabilize the area. In some cases that might involve resources, but I don't think it is particularly America's responsibility to pay for that. We've probably done more than any other country, but I, of course, would always be interested in the EU, and of course China could step up to the plate. You know, I'll tell you one thing I learned in my job working for the president in Africa is China's very involved in Africa, but they are not comfortable always engaging in some of these other activities. For example, they'll build a stadium in a country, they'll build the roads, but they've been hesitant to act to promote stability. But I think that's changing. They started providing some troops and supplies for some of the peacekeeping forces. I think the Chinese are open to the idea of working with us on stabilizing places because they benefit from a stable world as well. They don't want an unstable world either because they have so much economic activity. I think we need to have more conversations with the Chinese in particular about how we can work together on that.
Domestic issues, sir. Do you support a path to citizenship for the estimated 11 million immigrants here illegally? And if so, how should that citizenship be earned, sir?
I'm for comprehensive immigration reform. I think those who claim that the issue here is just closing the border are purposely putting that out there as a way not to deal with the issue. Of course you should do what you can to stop border problems. In fact, I voted many times for more border guards and using the proper technology to solve that. But we have to make sure that the answer to this issue involves the 11 million people that are in this country. And you know who tells me that more than anybody? Business people. The dairy industry in this state feels very, very strongly about this. The leading industrialists in this state want us to figure out a legal status. In some cases, with a proper process, over the course of many years, after a penalty is paid, perhaps after somebody touches base back in their home country, they can get in line for citizenship if everything else is square. But in the meantime, there is a world of difference between me and the incumbent senator who says, let's close the border first before we solve these other problems. That's not doing your job. We have to solve this problem of the 11 million people now for the sake of the families, but for the sake of our businesses who want us to solve this problem.
In the 1990s, you campaigned on a promise to raise most of your campaign donations from Wisconsin. In 2002, you co-sponsored McCain-Feingold. But of the $6.9 million your campaign raised last year from individuals, only 32% of that came from citizens of Wisconsin. In the current climate, do you, like other Senate candidates, both challengers and incumbent, feel that you've got to raise all the money that you can, sir?
No, my attitude about this is, first of all, the most money from any particular state still is from Wisconsin. We have 28,000 contributors from Wisconsin. After 5 days of the campaign, we received a contribution from every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties. And overall, our contributions are 95% $100 or less. But no, I did not make a commitment to have a majority of the contributions overall come from Wisconsin because guess what? The entire system was ruined by the Citizens United decision. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court said, you know, my promise was based on a previous system. They said, oh, by the way, for the first time in 100 years, corporations could use their treasuries, you know, without even necessarily reporting what they're doing to completely dominate the political process. I find this offensive. I believe that we should have grassroots campaigns. So my campaign is heavily based on Wisconsin contributors. But also, other people around the country are very concerned about what has happened with this system. Now, I purposely tried to deal with some of this outside money issue when the campaign started because I thought it would be good if we could keep a lot of these secret contributions and super PACs out of the state. So I offered Senator Johnson a pledge that was done in the Warren Brown race in Massachusetts, and it worked, called the Badger Pledge. It said, look, if people come in to spend these super PAC dollars, if it's done for me, I have to give money to a charity of my opponent's choice in order to compensate for that. He ignored it. He's never responded to it on the merits. And in fact, it's ironic that this issue even comes up because Senator Johnson completely embraces this system. He has 2 super PACs. I don't have one. He thinks Citizens United was a good decision. He raises substantial funds around the country, but he likes this system. I think it's a terrible system, and in fact, there no longer is a majority in the United States Supreme Court for the Citizens United decision, and I predict it will be overturned in the coming years.
Which is a follow-up question, Senator. If you are elected in November, you would be voting on the next Supreme Court nominee. Would you have an expectation that that nominee would vote to overturn Citizens United?
First of all, I assume that the current vacancy will be filled in this year if we're following the Constitution. So you're surmising another opening.
I'm just going along with the pledges of GOP leaders in Congress, sir.
It's a fair question. No, I would never expect anybody who wants to be a Supreme Court justice to say how they're going to rule in a case. I think it's wrong. I'll tell you this, though. Citizens United was one of the worst legal decisions in the history of this country. There was no record. It was based on false assumptions. It was based on the notion that these are really independent expenditures, that there's no link between the candidates and that there would be disclosure. Justice Kennedy, the only one who didn't say there should be disclosure was Clarence Thomas. Justice Kennedy said, we assume that there will be a congressional law requiring the disclosure of this. Well, of course, that was the opposite of what was done. So this decision will be overturned by any good judge, and I think that's what we'll get.
Let's stay on the Supreme Court a little bit. What's at stake here? Because you've heard the rhetoric saying the future of the Second Amendment is at stake, the future of the Affordable Care Act is at stake, and the future, some of those very important issues. Are they indeed at stake with the next nominee and justice, sir?
I'll tell you what's at stake is our Constitution. You have a group of people in the United States Senate, including the incumbent senator, who feel they don't need to follow the Constitution. The Constitution is absolutely explicit. The president shall nominate. He has to. The Senate is required to advise and consent. You can't say, we're not going to meet the guy. We're not going to hold hearings. I mean, even former Governor Tommy Thompson said this weekend in his candid way, of course there should be hearings. There's no reason why people can't vote against somebody. But the idea that you're not going to follow the Constitution on something as important as the founders' wisdom about how this system should work is terrible. You know, the founders had different amendments. They talked about maybe having the Senate picking justices, but they made their choice. And that is our foundational document. And there is no excuse for this. Now, look, you're looking at the only Senate candidate, and this does not get applause at Democratic Party meetings, the only Senate candidate who voted for a Republican-appointed Supreme Court justice. I voted for Chief Justice Roberts. He wouldn't have been my first choice. I've been mad at him a bunch of times. But you know what? When it came to the Affordable Care Act, he did, in my view, the right thing. And I voted against Alito, but I didn't refuse to meet with him. I met with him for an hour. I interviewed him. I was on the Judiciary Committee, and I announced that I would be voting against him because I didn't think he was open-minded enough to be on the court. But I never, ever, ever questioned that George Bush had the right to fill those seats. So what's happening here can only lead to a terrible future of both parties doing this if we don't stop it right now, this year, by confirming some appointment that President Obama would make.
If President Obama sought your counsel on who to nominate, what names would you give him?
I think I'd tell him to appoint himself or Joe Biden. That's all you get.
Moving
I'm
on.
not going any
Okay.
further. That was probably bad enough.
Should the United States go beyond the Affordable Care Act and take steps towards a universal single-payer system, Russ?
We got plenty to do with implementing the Affordable Care Act. I mean, one of the that was a very difficult decision to vote for the bill because of the misinformation that was out there and because it's very complex. And I'm glad that the issue has been resolved to the point where I think we all know it's here to stay. And now we can have honest conversations about the improvements that need to be made. There's things like the family glitch, where they only analyze a person's eligibility based on their own single status rather than their family status. There are important healthcare companies all over this city that have a lot of good ideas of things we can improve in it. And I am completely open to that, because the people of this country made the decision twice to support a president who made that his signature piece. Having said that, my opponent, Senator Johnson, continues to spend a lot of his time and resources on trying to fight it. He sued in federal court in Green Bay against the law, and it was thrown out as frivolous, basically. He then took it to the Court of Appeals in Chicago. It took up their time. They threw it out. Republican appointees. We need to move on, and we need to figure out what can be done to make this work better and to make it as affordable as possible. It needs to live up to its name, and that means more improvements to make sure it is affordable.
In a February 24 speech to WMC that I covered by Senator Johnson, he cited the Congressional Budget Office. He said the current $19 trillion deficit is on track to, within 30 years, he's citing CBO, grow to $103 trillion. Do any of your proposals have a plan to attack that deficit, sir?
My own?
Yes.
Yeah, the way that I first ran for the Senate was to propose a specific plan when I ran to reduce the federal deficit. It was an 82-point plan. And I remember that I was probably going to beat Jim Moody when he announced that he had a 92-point plan. What I believe is that it's one thing to just tell people what's out on the horizon. It's another thing to actually say what you're willing to cut. I have not seen that sort of proposal from the incumbent senator. And it's a lot of hard work, very specific work. There are a number of things that I believe we could deal with, such as carried interest. $17 billion that, of course, not only Donald Trump, but others agree doesn't make sense for these folks that are just getting regular income on their Wall Street work. There's other things that can be done, such as this problem that's come up that Johnson Controls is an example of. So, you know, companies are encouraged to take their operation, at least legally, to Ireland or Cayman Islands. Well, there can be a positive solution to this. We can repatriate that money. One of the ways I've thought about doing it is, okay, let's say they can't do it anymore. There's a bill that Dick Durbin has that would make it very difficult. I don't believe we should get rid of the corporate income tax, but maybe as part of a grand deal, we reduce that corporate tax a little bit. We use some of it to reduce the deficit, and we take a chunk of it to invest in that infrastructure that this country needs. Why can't we have people come together and do common sense proposals such as that? So those are a couple of things that I certainly support that would help us reduce the deficit and also move the country forward.
A follow-up on that subject, sir. I went to the Treasury Department website to get ready for this, and in 1993, when you entered the U.S. Senate, the national debt was $4 trillion. When you left, it was 15 to 16 trillion. What happened over that period? Now, you alone were not responsible.
Clearly, I was primarily responsible.
No,
I'll tell you what happened. I came to the United States Senate, and by the time I left, colleagues on both sides of the aisle called me the deficit hawk because I had the toughest voting record across party lines of voting against unnecessary spending. We did reduce the deficit. We even eliminated the deficit on a bipartisan basis in the early 90s with Bill Clinton and also Newt Gingrich. People that were not exactly my allies, like former Congressman Mark Newman, we were all working together to reduce that. And I voted against the policy, Steve, that led to this huge increase. I voted against the unfunded Iraq War. I voted against the unfunded Medicare Part D. I voted against repeated reckless spending, time and again, and so all I can say is I didn't agree with those policies that led to that huge increase, and I am determined, if I'm able to serve the people of the state, to fight to bring the deficit down. It's one of the issues I feel most strongly about.
Should Pentagon spending be cut, sir?
There are places where Pentagon spending can be cut. I understand, for example, that there are unnecessary warehouses in Afghanistan. It's not a huge amount of money, but places that just aren't needed anymore. There are larger questions about some of the weapon systems, the Joint Strike Fighter and others, whether they are the best way to go or whether we can go forward with the current airplanes that we have. This is an issue that's been around for a long time, but it involves real dollars.
You mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I covered one of your speeches and you said you'd read it. After reading it, what specific segments of Wisconsin's economy are most at risk under the TPP, sir?
I was able to read a summary of the main provisions of it all the way back in last March, and everything I've seen since then has confirmed for me that this is a further threat to the manufacturing base of this state. And we've been hit, but Wisconsin is still one of the highest percentage states in the country for manufacturing. It is still a deal that is calculated to have us lose more of those companies. Among the reasons are it encourages companies to go to places that have much lower wages. And as a part of the deal, they get to go to countries where they don't have to follow all the environmental laws and a lot of the worker protection laws. So this is another agreement that encourages that. In addition, it weakens our own ability to protect America by putting corporations in the same positions as countries in their ability to come in here and sue us for damages in a devastating way if we have, for example, a food safety law or a Buy American law. That's what's in that deal. They are given a status that they've never had before. So that could affect not only many Wisconsin industries and manufacturing, but it also could have a negative impact on our ability to protect the laws that we have passed to protect ourselves.
Do you support President Obama and the EPA's initiatives on climate change, sir?
I think the President made a good move by moving us in the direction of the Clean Power Plan. As people study this, they realize what this is an opportunity for each state to craft a way to redo their energy in a way that is consistent with reducing emissions. For Wisconsin, it's interesting, because we rely 60% on coal, and I assume we still will, and I admire and work with the coal companies that work in this state. Having said that, we don't produce the coal, so it's expensive to get the coal, to ship the rail lines back. The more we can get into alternatives such as solar and wind and others to get the right mix under this kind of a plan where you don't have a one-size-fits-all, to me it makes some sense. And we ought to give it a try instead of condemning it immediately as was done by Senator Johnson, instead of suing against it as Governor Walker did. I think this is a pretty reasonable approach that could be consistent not only with the environment and stopping climate change, but consistent with Wisconsin job opportunities.
A recent study said Wisconsin residents have the third highest student debt load. Should there be a federal solution to that, sir?
Well, we have to solve the problem. It's truly a crisis. When Senator Johnson and I were both in college, we're roughly the same age. He was at the University of Minnesota, and I was at the University of Wisconsin. I'm just pointing out the factual aspect of this. You know, Senator Johnson has said that he worked through college to pay his tuition, which I give him credit for. But it was $600. Okay? When you say to a young person today, University of Wisconsin-Madison, tuition alone in-state is close to $11,000 per year. A full year at Madison is about to hit about $25,000, $100,000. This is not something you can do working while you're in school very easily. And so if we don't do something to change the way this is happening, we're going to have a society where you just got to figure out how are you going to get born in the right family. You know, how do you do that? Otherwise, you don't get a chance to finance your higher education. So, you know, what I've talked about, and Senator Johnson has said repeatedly that he doesn't believe that the federal government should even be involved in student loans. I think we need to reform the way in which interest is paid on this, because currently you can refinance your mortgage, but you can't refinance very effectively your student loan. Senator Warren has a bill that would do that, and I would support it. Senator Johnson voted against it. Secondly, if you talk to students, and I've been to about 12 campuses having roundtables about this, they say it's frightening to take out these loans, and those FAFSA forms are overwhelmingly complicated, and there's not much help to figure them out. We can do something about that. We also could make sure that the federal government can't profit off of this. Right now, they make extra money off it. It goes into the general treasury. It should be plowed back into making sure students can pay. And I think we should look at the national initiatives that are being discussed, particularly by the Democratic candidates, to see if we can figure out a way to get to a debt-free college situation. That would probably involve a block grants from the federal government where the states need to step up to the plate and get back to where they used to be, which is really helping to pay for tuition. They have really dropped the ball. We need to incentivize changing that. And just to conclude, because it's such, probably the number one issue I hear, the overall number one thing I hear is the challenge of middle class and working families paying their bills. And in that context, this is number one. When I went to UWM to talk to the students, one young lady said to me, Mr. Feingold, you got to understand that sometimes when you go out on a first date, this is what you talk about, what your student loan load is. And I think we need a better icebreaker for our young people when they're on a date like that.
This is my final question before we turn it over to your questions. You have not endorsed either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. But would you as a senator vote for the major changes, raising taxes on the wealthiest 1% to pay for free public university tuition, for example, that a President Sanders would recommend?
What's your question on that?
Would you vote for the major shift in income that a President Sanders would recommend to pay for things like free tuition?
Not necessarily. I'd have to see the proposal. I'm not giving anybody my vote before I see the proposal. It would have to know exactly how it's going to be paid for. You notice in everything you've asked me about, I've talked about how you pay for it. So when I talk about, for example, the need to reinvest in our infrastructure in this country, I didn't say let's use funny money. I said let's figure out a way to use some of that money from this inversion problem with companies. So I'm a stickler on this stuff, and I believe things have to be paid for unless it's an extreme emergency, and so that would be the first question I would ask President Sanders.
Thank you. Now it's time for your questions. Please stand. The issue is how to restore civility across the aisle in Congress. Correct, sir? Sir.
Well, I think it's probably about elections. If people who aren't civil get elected, the message is don't be civil and you get elected. If the message is you're repudiated if you're not civil, and it goes outside of what we believe the way Americans should treat each other, that's how politicians respond. People say to me, how did the Senate get this way? Well, the Senate didn't get this way. Frankly, a lot of the Republicans became scared to death that they were going to get primaried by Tea Party people. People are very polite. I'll give you an example of my upbringing. I believe I mentioned that Paul Ryan and I went to the same high school, Janesville Craig. He's a lot younger than I am, so we weren't there at the same time. But our families understood that you have to always treat each other with respect. And you notice that Congressman Ryan, who I couldn't disagree with more, is very polite. He was always nice to my mom, and I was nice to his mom. And you know what? That's how we should act at the national level. And I mean that sincerely, because I think about the fact that when I was a little kid and I saw those Kennedy-Nixon debates, and when I was 10 and 12 and starting to form my view of politics, it's incredibly formative. We are creating generations of people right now who are getting a horrible message about the way you should behave yourself. In fact, one cartoon showed a principal, had this tough-looking little kid come in, he was all bruised up, and the principal says, you're saying these horrible, mean things about everybody, and you're using awful language, and he's got "I'm for Trump" button on, the kid does. But that's serious. How people think and develop a view about how they should conduct themselves as adults begins at a young age. So I think it's fair to say I've always tried to be civil. I will be civil, and I think we should encourage others to do that as well.
Thank you. The question for those that didn't hear it, the future of the littoral ships for the Navy that are made in the great state of Wisconsin. Sir.
Well, it's the proof that McCain and Feingold don't always agree. I think he's the one going after it. I dealt with this issue when I was in the Senate. I was persuaded that they had merit, and I do not believe that the argument against them as not being worthwhile has validity, but I know that they keep coming back at it. I would support that business.
The follow-up is how to manage the debt since the two biggest entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, right, Rob? Thank you.
Well, you can say those are the two biggest drivers, but there's an omission there of the fact that we're going to need revenue also. So the game of ignoring any revenue sources to solve our problems stops any progress. Now, on those issues, we can do some things to make it more affordable in the context of a larger package. I don't see why we couldn't do what most people agree with, which is to raise that FICA level a certain amount. I know that's not going to solve the whole problem, but it's something to put on the table in order to make sure that we are responsible about Social Security. What I won't support, however, is eliminating or privatizing these programs. But if we're willing to have a conversation about further changes in Social Security and Medicare, as long as we can keep the commitment to our seniors in the context of there being revenue, particularly the kinds of things I'm talking about, these loopholes and others that can be closed, it is the only responsible thing is to try to come up with that kind of an agreement.
The question is, Mr. Feingold, the two biggest mistakes are that made by President Obama.
Well, he probably shouldn't have called ISIS a JV team. I think he would be the first to agree that that was, you know, a tendency that I saw in this administration and even on the side of senators to not take seriously some of these terrorist threats, to minimize them. In fact, I had a chance to write a book after 2010 about what I wanted. And I wrote a book called While America Sleeps. And my book was about the fact that I think people were too quick to write off these terrorist threats. You see it here when you see the incumbent senator talking about ISIS, but he's not talking about Al-Qaeda. In that book, in 2011, I started telling people about Boko Haram in Nigeria. Nobody knew what it was, but I knew because I'd been on the Intelligence Committee and I'd worked on Africa. And I said, look, I think these guys are dangerous. I think they might connect up with other people. The knee-jerk reaction of the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and the administration was to say, oh, no, they're just local people that are mad. No. There is an enormous attraction of this ideology. And I fear that both parties, including the president at times, have not looked at the global scope of this threat. So that is, you know, I believe that now the president is working very hard to address these issues, but we need to stop thinking country by country, group by group. It is all interrelated, and we have to become much more sophisticated in that regard.
We're coming up on the April 15 tax filing deadline. What changes would you recommend?
So one of the great unfinished agenda items over the last 30 years. You know, when the contract with America came in, if you read the contract, they said they were going to do tax reform. And I was kind of, you know, eager to see what it was going to be. They never did it. They just keep making more and more loopholes. That's because this campaign finance system is set up in a way that those who contribute can cash in after an election and get another loophole, and the tax code starts looking like Swiss cheese. I'm a believer in the progressive income tax, but I'm willing to look at other alternatives. I would love to look at a way that would simplify this. We also, I think, can do changes in terms of the way in which people have to prepare their tax returns. There's some interesting ideas out there about the government having to take a greater responsibility to provide you with some of that data about your taxes so you don't have to collect all the stuff yourself. So there are interesting ideas about doing that. But I would love to see a genuine effort to reform the tax code in a way that both parties could work together, because it's a bipartisan, nonpartisan request that people have been making for decades, and it's long overdue.
Do you see any connection between the expenditure of all of that to gross national product of our country to the rather subpar increase in the production of the United States?
I'll tell you, any time you have large expenditures that don't produce the results in terms of being competitive with other countries, there's a good chance there's a fair amount of waste that should be eliminated, and there's a fair amount of inefficiency. That's why I believe in being very specific about things, whether it's in the healthcare area, as I've already been, on the defense budget, and even education budgets, about things that work and don't work. Good example is I voted against the No Child Left Behind bill, because I thought it was a big top-down thing about requiring tests in every school in the country, and then teachers had to teach to the test. I don't like that kind of top-down Washington thing when it isn't necessary. And so I think you could find in each of those areas places where we could be more efficient, and some places cut spending. And yes, I would say to the extent you have wasteful spending in government, it can have a negative impact on our positive development in the economy.
All the questions have come from men. There's some very talented women in the room. It's your turn. The question is the response to GOP leaders of the Senate who have said they will neither hold hearings or a vote on whoever President Obama recommends for the next Supreme Court justice.
Well, sadly, I think they do understand what their obligations are, but they are so concerned about the very extreme elements in their political party that they're willing to not follow the Constitution out of political fear. You can't impeach senators. Look, the remedy isn't impeachment. The remedy's at the ballot box. If they're willing to snub their nose at this president, to treat him with no respect after he was elected twice, to not fill that seat in a way that's never been done in the history of this country, I think you're going to find the people of this country will rise up on November 8th, and they're going to elect a president who's not going to put up with that, and they're going to elect the United States Senate that's not going to put up with it. But my hope is it doesn't end up like that. My hope is as soon as there's a human face, an appointee, which I expect any day, the people will realize, wait a minute, you have to have a hearing, and then you're going to have a vote, and maybe they won't vote for the person. I'm not saying they have to approve his choice, but the idea that they won't even start the process for political reasons, for their political base, with their reelection in mind, is one of the worst things I've ever seen done by a political party and by those that hold those offices.
Final question. Do you have a follow-up?
Follow-up.
Okay. Thoughts on how to address the apathy of the millennials, sir?
The millennials are not apathetic. I've spent the last 5 years teaching, primarily. Teaching at Marquette University Law School, teaching at Lawrence, teaching at Stanford, and I spent loads and loads of time, office hours, meetings. They are skeptical about the political process. They're skeptical about the political parties. Wonder why. All they've seen is really a horrible display. But they're incredibly dedicated to justice, domestic justice, justice internationally. When I first got a chance to go in eastern Congo, where I was working, one of the worst tragic situations in the world, I went there with Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, who was a special envoy. The 5 of us took a bus to an IDP camp, like a refugee camp. And there were 40,000 people there, and there was only one of these camps. And the person in charge of this whole area, I get off, and there's this really young woman. She goes, "Hey, Russ Feingold." She had finished college, decided to go to one of the most dangerous areas in the world, and was largely in charge of these people's lives at age 23. That was a millennial. And she's from Toma. And the place where we went was Goma. So I like to say she went from Toma to Goma because she cares about humanity. And that's who I believe the millennials are. Yeah, we got to get them to vote. But let's begin with the proposition that it's not their fault. It's everybody else's fault, older people's fault, that they feel turned off by the political process. My guess is the Republican debates aren't helping this. But look, I think they're ready to be engaged if they see that it has something to do with their generation's future. And I think it's going to be one of those great generations.
Final quick question for me. I know 5 states vote today, but if the nominees are Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, can you preview the presidential campaign just a little bit?
It's like previewing, the next Netflix show. Now, look, yeah, I think I can. I think what's going to happen there is that Mr. Trump will finally have to face somebody who really knows the issues, who knows how to handle herself if she's the nominee. And I don't think he's going to be able to intimidate her. She's pretty tough to intimidate. He's good at it, but she may even be better at withstanding it. And she's going to force him she's going to reveal the fact that he doesn't really know what he's talking about on basically any issue. We know that. He doesn't know when he says, "I'm going to be the best guy for the military ever. You won't believe how great the military is going to be." Hillary Clinton knows her stuff. She knows the issues better than anybody that I have met in recent years. And whether you particularly like her or don't like her, she is enormously prepared to be president. So I think it'll be fascinating, and I think it'll be, actually in the end, she'll be elected. In the meantime, I'm sure there'll be some entertainment value. But my guess is in the end, we'll have a strong, qualified president next year.
Thank you. Before Dan gives us some closing announcements, would you join me in thanking our guest, Russ Feingold?
Okay. Well, thank you, Senator Feingold. We certainly appreciate your comments, and we appreciate your thoughts on civility. I think we all would appreciate a little more civility. As you know, Rotary has been an international leader in the effort to eradicate polio, and that over the last 30 years, 2.5 billion kids around the world have been immunized as a result of our efforts, and we're almost there. So in your name, we'll be making a donation to the Rotary Foundation so that 50 additional children do get an immunization so that we're closer to our goal of eliminating polio.
Thank you. I worked with the Rotary on this for many years, and I'm very honored by that.
You're very welcome. Let me see. I can't do this one-handed up here. So following our adjournment, Environment and Ecology meets in room 413. Next week, March 22nd, join us for a joint program with the Press Club to hear County Executive Chris Abley. Senator Chris Larson, also a candidate for County Executive, will join us on March 29th. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all.
An MCM production.